What is going on with y'all, man? It is Black Balloon, and I'm coming back with another video, so y'all already know what's going on. Alright, y'all. Y'all already knew I was gonna have to do this video in light of recent news, and the fact that the submersible that supposedly went missing on June 18, 2023 has now run out of emergency oxygen. So it supposedly had 96 hours of emergency oxygen left. It has now unfortunately ran out of that oxygen for the 5 passengers that are supposedly on the submersible. Now we're going to use this video to get into what we think really happened. We're also going to have to go way back in history and talk about the Titanic, the ship that never sank. This video will be pretty interesting because I did find an article that details a lot of red flags about whether or not the ship that they said sank really sank, and the possibilities of it actually being a swap. I'm gonna try my best to just kind of weave around a couple things so this video doesn't get flagged and they just get pushed right up to YouTube, because I really want everybody to see this video. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the article about the ship that never sank. So it says, it's an historical irony that the most famous ship to ever sail was famous because it actually sank. So it says it hit an iceberg on a maiden voyage early on the morning of the 15th, April 1912. Now I went all the way back to see what date that was, and that was Sunday night / Monday morning. Now we don't know exactly what the range would have been, and if it indeed did sink Sunday night, that would hold, that would say a lot about everything. We'll get to that a little bit later in the video. So it goes on to say within 3 hours, catch that number 3, it had sunk to the bottom of the ocean, killing 1,500 of the ship's 2,200 passengers and crew. It says the Olympic, this is getting into the sister ship, was launched a year before the Titanic, but seemed to share its more famous sister ship's poor luck. Now we're going to get into the background of how possibly the swap was done and why. Within months of the Olympics launch in 1911, now mind you, this was before the Titanic, it had 2 serious collisions. It collided with a Royal Navy cruiser, and it also had serious structural damage to the Olympic's keel and steel beams. Some authors have suggested that the damage to the Olympics was more serious than admitted. In fact, it was virtually a write-off. Repairs would be expensive, running into millions of pounds. The already troubled White Star Line was facing a potential financial disaster. So, could White Star and its owner, J.P. Morgan, have devised an audacious insurance scam to try and salvage their investment in the troubled Olympic line? The Olympic, the theory goes, would be swapped with the Titanic and sunk in a stage accident. The Titanic, now disguised as the Olympic, would then carry on in service. The 2 ships were essentially identical, save for minor differences, and were moored side by side in dry dock. The swap would entail nothing more elaborate than swapping a few nameplates and plaques. Although not a new theory, this was popularized in a 1998 book, Titanic, the ship that never sank. So, could it really have been an Olympic that sank in the Titanic's place? Now we're going to move into some evidence. Proponents of the swap theory have pointed out disparities in the number of portholes on the ships. The Olympic had 16 and the Titanic had 14. Photographs taken of the Titanic in dry dock show it was 14 portholes, but by the time of its doomed maiden voyage, it now had 16, just like the Olympic. Was this evidence that the ships had been swapped, or just that they had added 2 extra portholes as a part of aesthetic changes to the Titanic? And we'll let you make that decision. If you look closely here, you see the difference. The top is a Titanic with the 14 portholes. The bottom is a Titanic with the 16 portholes. Now, I highly doubt they made those changes just for aesthetic purposes. It says other evidence supports the switch. The windows on the Olympic were somewhat unevenly spaced, but more evenly spaced on the Titanic. By the time of its maiden voyage, the Titanic had acquired unevenly spaced windows just like the Olympic. Now, if you look up here, you can see the unevenly spaced windows. All of these openings on the side are windows. You can see one picture, they're pretty even. Another picture, they're uneven. So it says the damage to the Olympic after its collision with the Hawk lent a noticeable and permanent 2 degrees list to the port. The undamaged Titanic had no such list. So now we're going to go into the rumors amongst the crew. There was a nationwide coal strike during the launch of the Titanic, leading to thousands of firemen, boiler stokers, and greasers short of work. Yet despite this, Titanic struggled to find crew, with many men refusing to work on the ship at any price. Rumors were circulating amongst the workers at Harland and Wolff that the ships had been swapped as a part of an insurance scam, and Titanic was to be sunk. Did foreknowledge of the sinking of the Titanic frighten men from wanting to work on the ship? Despite the immense fanfare and hype that surrounded the Titanic launch, it was only just over half full when it left Southampton on its doomed voyage. Did White Star want to minimize the number of passengers because it intended to scuttle the ship? Or had the rumors of the insurance scam spread outside of the shipyards? Several last-minute cancellations from high-profile passengers certainly suggest some kind of knowledge, some kind of foreknowledge. Now this is where it gets interesting. Last-minute cancellations. Many of the richest and most prestigious names in early 20th century society were booked onto the Titanic. J.P. Morgan, the international financier who owned the White Star's parent company, was due to travel on a Titanic but canceled his trip a few days before the departure, claiming illness. A New York Times reporter discovered this to be a lie. Morgan was actually seen perfectly well with his mistress in France on the very day Titanic sunk. Industrialist Henry Clay Frick and his wife, banker Horace J. Harding, and billionaire George Washington Vanderbilt, all connected to Morgan, were amongst several other prominent figures who canceled at the last minute. The California, the SS Californian, also owned by J.P. Morgan, was a large passenger ship that was ultimately blamed for the loss of the life on Titanic. It behaved somewhat oddly around the time of the Titanic's voyage. Carrying no passengers, it steamed into the middle of the Atlantic, stopped, and waited. Its only cargo was 3,000 woolen blankets and jumpers. And we'll wonder why the cargo was only 3,000 woolen blankets and jumpers. Sounds like a rescue mission. Goes on to say, what was the purpose behind this curious maneuver? Was the Californian intended to rescue the Titanic passengers after its deliberate sinking? With the Californian unable to complete its rescue mission, the Titanic was doomed, and some 1,500 passengers and crew perished in one of the worst maritime disasters in modern history. Supposedly, the SS Californian had navigation errors, and it led it to stopping in the wrong area 12 miles away from the Titanic. And the lifeboats on the Titanic weren't sufficient to save all the passengers. So this supposedly planned SS Californian that was basically in the waters just to, rescue the passengers because it was all planned, supposedly never made it. Then we get on to the wreck. The wreck of the Titanic was discovered by Robert Ballard in 1985. Some evidence from the wreck supports the switch theory. The stamp 401, the ID number used for the Titanic at Harland and Wolff, can be seen on the Titanic's propeller. However, some authors have suggested that the Titanic propeller was fitted to the Olympic during its repair following the collision with the Hawk. If true, this would be strong evidence that the vessel on the ocean floor was really the Olympic and not the Titanic. Now, this would be literally at the bottom of the ocean, on the ocean floor. What appear to be letters M and P can also be seen on the side of the wreck. Could that be the remains of the ship's original etched nameplate, Olympic, covered over the Titanic as part of the scam? The wreck appears to show some evidence of gray paint used as an undercoat on the Olympic. The Titanic used black paint for its undercoat. Lack of media scrutiny. Insurance scams and maritime fraud were common at the time of the sinking. While it seemed unlikely such a scam could be pulled off today, the lack of media coverage in 1912 makes it more credible. And it makes sense because it was a billionaire behind it all, J.P. Morgan. So it goes on to say that the two ships were extremely similar. And it's argued that only the most eagle-eyed people would ever have spotted the swap. So meaning you would have to have been around it. You'd have to, seen the ships multiple times to even be able to spot that these two ships were swapped. That, the average person, Even the above average person wouldn't have noticed it. The Titanic was infamously described as unsinkable. While this proved to be incorrect, only a freak set of circumstances managed to sink it. Could plotters really have engineered something so complex as the sinking of the world's largest vessel in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? With so many variables and so many things that could go wrong, how could they be sure they would succeed? If their plan was discovered, the consequences would have been dire. The perpetrators would have been blamed for the deaths of 1,500 people, perhaps even charged with their murder. Would the likes of Whiteline and J.P. Morgan, a billionaire who could afford any potential losses on the Olympic, really risk the gallows for an insurance scam? The Olympic, or if the insurance swap theory is true, the Titanic, disguised as the Olympic, continued to serve for many years. It acted as troop transport in World War I and resumed service as a luxury liner in the 20s and 30s before finally being retired in 1935. Now, guess what? In all of that time, no evidence that the ship was really the Titanic was ever discovered. Even when it was dismantled in 1936, there was no indication that the ship was anything other than the Olympic. Now that says a lot. It says no evidence that the ship was really the Titanic was ever discovered. And even when it was dismantled, there was no indication that the ship was anything other than the Olympic. All right. So now I know over time a lot of people have, been interested in the entire, Titanic thing and whether or not the ship actually sank the way that they said, or, it possibly being people, other bankers and stuff that were on the ship, and that this was all some kind of big, sacrifice toward some of the more important and powerful people that were on that ship. Because this article doesn't go into that, the fact that there were other names supposedly on the ship that were in the banker world that, these really high, powerful billionaire bankers wanted to basically get up out of here because they weren't on board with, their plans and their agenda in the banking industry back in the early 1900s. Because some of this stuff goes with the video I did. I think it was the Canaanites and the Rockefellers, and because J.P. Morgan was tied into all of this stuff back in the early 1900s as far as, the banking industry goes. And that just the entire central banking system from the Rothschilds is deep. This is connected to much bigger things than just an insurance scam. And I think the article, to me, I think the theory is true, but there's also a lot more on why it happened than just it being an insurance scam, and that is even just a theory to people. Obviously the average person doesn't believe it at all. They just, take what the narrative is and they run with it, and they're sad because a bunch of people supposedly died. But, I believe it was a lot deeper than them just running a scam in order to get, their money back, their investment back. Because just like he said, a billionaire in 1912 like J.P. Morgan, it doesn't matter that he would have lost money on a ship. He owned multiple ships, so it doesn't matter, as far as him running an insurance scam. I think this was all a huge plot at the end of the day. Now, here's like one of those pictures that used to kind of go viral about the Titanic and supposedly some of the other richest men in the world that were on the, supposed ship, right? So it says a 1898 creation of Morgan Robertson detailed the sinking of an unsinkable ship, the largest vessel afloat. This imaginary ship named Titan collided with the iceberg during April, resulting in a high loss of life because the ship carried too few lifeboats. Largest ship in the world didn't have enough lifeboats. That's crazy. So it says 14 years later, with uncanny similarities, the real ship, the Titanic, recreated what happened in the novel. The two ships had almost identical names. Both ships were designated unsinkable. Both were touted as the largest ships at sea. Both collided with icebergs in April. Both resulted in many deaths due to a shortage of lifeboats. Plus, both had strikingly similar floor plans and technical descriptions. Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore Strauss, the head of Macy's department stores, and John Jacob Astor, probably the wealthiest man in the world, were all killed when it sank. Those three men were the main opposition to the creation of the U.S. Fed. By April 1912, all opposition to the Federal Reserve was eliminated. In December of 1913, the Federal Reserve came into being in the United States, controlled by the banksters, which was the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and so on. Remember, I did a video. This is what I was just talking about. I did a video on the Federal Reserve and how it was basically conceived over an altar here in Georgia. I think it was in Savannah. I can't remember all the details of that video, but it's on my channel. I think it's called like the Fed and Altars and Canaanite something. I forget what I named the video. It's literally on my channel. It's a really good video. It's one of those videos with a lot of information. So, it's kind of boring because it's not so popular as, a lot of people don't actually know about it, because basically the meeting that they had to, when they basically founded the U.S. Federal Reserve, they did it over a demonic altar. So, it was basically ushered in, through a ritual, because at the end of the day, it's a control system. It's a central control system of money. And money is always related back to being the root of all evil, or as they say, the love of money is the root of all evil. But at the end of the day, it starts with a note, the note, the paper, the money itself, and the U.S. Federal Reserve, and how it was basically conceived, how it was started. And so supposedly, once again, this was a lot deeper than just an insurance scam. And the names were Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore Strauss, the head of Macy's, and John Jacob, who was probably even more wealthy than J.P. Morgan at the time. They were all killed. And like I said, as this reads, they were the main opposition to the creation of the U.S. Fed. Now, go back and watch that video. I can put the video as a link in this description, and it will explain basically a little bit deeper into this theory. Now that we've covered the history of the Titanic and its possible swap with a sister ship called the Olympic, we fast forward all the way to 2023. Now it says, expert search teams called from across the world continue to scour a small stretch of the North Atlantic Ocean on Thursday for the tourist submersible that vanished while diving to the infamous Titanic wreck over the weekend. The Titan sub is operated by OceanGate Expeditions, a private company that hawks controversial tours of the site where the ocean liner came to rest in two parts after it struck an iceberg and sank off the Canadian coast in the early hours of April 15th, 1912. Now, y'all know me. I went all the way back to see what day April 15th, 1912 was, and that would have been, now we don't necessarily know what's accurate. That could have been a Sunday night, or that could have been Monday morning. Obviously, this was, a very long time ago. It was over 100 years ago. So this is very close to being the same exact day that the submersible basically went missing on Sunday, June 18th. Catch that date. June 18th on a Sunday, 2023. There's a lot of numerology here. We're in the 6th month of the year. On the 18th, y'all. On the 18th. We already know 18 breaks down to 3 6s. In 2023. 3, 2, 2. There's a lot of numerology here. You already know. 322. Skull and bones. There's a lot of numerology that goes here. That's why I was like, April 15th, 1912. Now, if it was early morning, it would have been on a Monday morning back in 1912. But if it actually happened, it could have happened overnight. It could have been on a Sunday night. We don't really know. You know, we weren't, none of us were thought of back in 1912. So, it says the Titan set off from St. John's on the coast of Newfoundland on Friday. And this is the 5 crew members on board of the Titan submersible. And they have been missing since Sunday, June 18th. So, you know, I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna go at this point. We already know what's going on. Number one, the story from the beginning of the Titanic, when it sank, everything, that we just read about it, we already know that was a lie. All right. So I'm not gonna go crazy here with my words because I want this video to go right up to YouTube. And yet y'all already know how it is when you go against the narrative of when they have stories where people are possibly dead, things start getting flagged. So I'm gonna let y'all in the comments go ahead and tell me what it is, what I want to say. Just let it out in the comments, because this shit is, y'all already know this some whole BS. And I already knew it as soon as all this stuff started going viral on the internet. The Titanic, the ship that never sank.